Let's go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome. It's great to have you. Great to see you here for one of our monthly Q&A sessions. We have a lot in store for this one. This one is all about employee resource groups, or ERGs. So let's jump in with a quick intro so that I can explain who I am and hopefully get started with answering any questions you might have. My name is Natalia. It's wonderful to meet you. I lead an amazing firm called C-Network. We're really happy to be bringing you this content for free, just talking about employee resource groups. Before I do dig into that, I wanted to tell you a little bit more about myself. I have experience working in diversity, equity, and inclusion at places like Facebook and Teach for America. I also had my degrees in my bachelor's degree at NYU was very much related to oppressive political structures and critical race theory. And at Wharton, my MBA is related to inclusion in the workplace and organizational effectiveness. So I've been living and breathing this stuff for 9, almost 10 years now. And I founded C-Network, which is a diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting firm that does this exclusively. And we have just a wonderful team. Here's a little snapshot of them. And you can learn more about us at cnetwork.com if you're curious. Here's a little bit of history about employee resource groups in case you're unfamiliar. So employee resource groups have been in existence within organizations and companies since around the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement. Around that time, Xerox is credited for being the first company to have a company-wide employee resource group. It was their National Black Employees Caucus. And it really came out of a lot of conversation related to what was happening within the Civil Rights Movement. Apparently, there was quite a bit happening in Rochester, New York, where Xerox is headquartered at the time. And it really came about because employees were asking for it. And so there's quite an extensive history of employee resource groups coming together. That was the first one. And later in 1978, Hewlett-Packard is credited for having the first one that was LGBTQ. It was called the Gay and Lesbian Employee Network, or GLEN. And of course, since then, there have been many additional employee resource groups of employees coming together across a specific identity. And we've even seen some more intersectional groups, so groups that are broken off even further. So not just based off of race or gender or sexuality or gender identity, but specifically this Black Women's Leadership Caucus was launched out of Xerox. And that is obviously kind of like a subset, right? That came out of the National Black Employees Caucus, where Black women felt like they wanted a space as well. And today we know that there are many different employee resource groups, and there's an acceleration even happening in the last few years around this topic within a bunch of different organizations. We see here that 90% of Fortune 500 companies have employee resource groups. And maybe you're very familiar with what an employee resource group is. Maybe you have one at your company, but you call it something different. Let me just quickly go through what some of those other names for ERGs might be, other names that you might be more familiar with. So at some companies, employee resource groups are called Affinity Groups, and they emphasize this idea of community building and empowerment. And so when they have that title, Affinity Groups, they're often really emphasizing that sense of community that they can bring about and pull together for employees. We also know that they can sometimes be called business resource groups. So maybe you've heard of that before. And this is where companies will emphasize the importance of these groups to the business. And, we often see companies that decide to call their employee resource groups business resource groups. We see them also leverage them as advisors and supporters of their different business products, and really thinking about them that way. But of course, employee resource groups are always beneficial to the business, no matter what they're called, right? And then, of course, lastly, we have this other title that we'll be using most throughout our time together, but wanted to make sure that you knew that they're not just called employee resource groups. And in fact, there's some different combinations of these titles that you might see at different organizations. And this employee resource group title does emphasize the fact that these groups meet multiple needs for employees. And that's why they're resource groups for employees, right? Now, maybe you're still wondering exactly what these employee resource groups do. They do a whole host of things. Oh, and I already see a couple of questions coming through. Great, keep them coming. Feel free to put them in the questions bucket and I will get to them. Please put them all in there and I'll get to them right after this. Maybe you're wondering what an employee resource group does. For us, when we're working with clients, helping them set up employee resource groups or helping them reignite the energy that was around their employee resource groups or create a little bit more structure around them, we like to talk about the activities of an employee resource group based off of a couple of pillars. So we have 3 pillars specifically that we suggest everyone consider for their employee resource groups. And those 3 pillars are solidarity, advocacy, and education. So these are the pillars under which most activities that the employee resource group engages in will fall under. So let's talk about each one briefly. And I think when I'm answering some of your questions, I might go back to this as well. So I might go back to this slide when we're talking through this, but solidarity. Some of the things employee resource groups do are really meant to create community and really meant to create safe spaces and targeted opportunities for the members that have joined, particularly those who identify with the affinity or the identity that the ERG is meant to represent. Now, of course, employee resource groups should have allies as well, right? And so these opportunities for community offer opportunities for both allies and those who identify to come together. They also might allow for some opportunity for those who just identify to come together and discuss a topic or something that they've really been finding that they'll find solace in talking to others within the company who identify similarly with. So that's solidarity. Then there's advocacy. An ERG is ideally in a position to support that group in getting certain opportunities within the organization, in giving the organization feedback around how they can do a better job of supporting those across their employee base who identify a particular way. And that's what that advocacy piece is all about. And then we have education, where under education, we suggest that an employee resource group and many of the initiatives that they end up doing really fall within this bucket, that they foster an environment that encourages that continued growth. So maybe they bring in speakers or host talks or provide space for people to do storytelling, or they'll set up initiatives where people are going into the community and learning more about a particular experience that one might have or a particular identity. Or maybe they're setting up opportunities for book clubs or for movie nights and whatnot that are related to the identity. So a lot of the things that employee resource groups do fit under these pillars. Now, I just went pretty briefly over those pillars and over the history of ERGs. What I'm actually just giving you is a sneak peek into our course, which you can see right there is on our website. This is a screenshot of the site where you can take the course for, at any point, you can just download it and take the course and learn more. Of course, this is a Q&A session where hopefully it's a free opportunity to have your questions answered. But if you're craving more, I just gave you the first 5-10 minutes of the course. And ideally, if you did want to learn more, you can just hop back over there and learn more there. Okay, great. So I'm going to look now at the questions, which we actually have a couple that have come through. let's see. Okay, there are a couple of long ones, so I'm trying to see if I can condense them quickly. Let's see. Okay. Before ERGs are launched, I've seen it work best to have some kind of DEI council or founding body that spans groups and perhaps lays a blueprint for the creation of ERGs or shares resources across them and manages best practices. Does your experience validate that? Or are there other ways to approach creating those first few crucial ERGs? Lovely, love this question. So thank you so much for asking this question. And I'm going to keep anyone who submits questions anonymous, just to keep it that way as I go through, since there are quite a few here. But thank you very much for submitting your question. So it is possible to start employee resource groups by having first this DEI council or task force that then kind of spreads it outward. That is one way to go about doing ERGs. I will say, though, that often one of the more effective ways of starting employee resource groups is to see if there are pockets across your organization where there's already some organic activity happening. So what we find is that many times employees will come together across these different identities that they might have, these different affinities. They'll come together, maybe they'll share something with a manager or with a supervisor saying that they really wish there was something like this available, or maybe they've put together an event of some sort. Many times there's some self-organizing that's happened within within different organizations that don't already have employee resource groups. And so a good way to potentially start is by looking to see if those grassroots organizations or those grassroots communities exist. And many times you'll find that they do, or that there are certain people that have said that they've really always wanted something like this, but have not had the opportunity to do so, or don't know where to start. So if for whatever reason your organization has those grassroots kind of rumblings happening, you'll want to check in on that first, because that can give you a good indication as to how ready your organization is for what you're describing, which is more of a top-down approach. The one consideration that I would have for you, if I were doing what you're suggesting, which is starting from the very top and then creating something, that you tell employees about, is that sometimes the uptake isn't there, or the uptake isn't as strong unless you've had people who are already motivated driving that decision. So what we've seen go wrong sometimes is an organization will put together something like a council or something like a task force, and that task force will say, okay, we're going to start these employee resource groups. And then there isn't that much excitement around them because there's a real push that you're going to have to do to communicate this effort. There's a real change management kind of push that you're going to have to get off the ground. And that is way easier if you have help from the grassroots. So if I were you and I were already moving forward with this founding body of an ERG or of a DEI, all the different letters of a DEI task force, I would maybe have that task force look to see if there is any excitement from the grassroots before kind of just putting something down. And you can do that by saying that you're thinking about starting employee resource groups. Would people have interest, or have people already started it? Maybe have the survey go out and let people know that they can let you know. And then I would start very slowly, because what we also have seen happen is that sometimes organizations will want to do, a Black ERG, a Pride ERG, a Women's ERG, a Latinx ERG. They're just doing too much. And the company going from 0 to 100 is not ready for that. Okay. I hope that was helpful. Feel free to ask more questions if you like. We have a couple more coming through. If we only have space and budget for one ERG, what should we start with? Thank you for asking this question. And actually, maybe I answered it a little bit here, because what I would start with is whatever your employee base is most excited about. So if there have been initially some maybe events around women in your workplace, or some events around recent Black Lives Matter movement considerations, maybe you have some Black employees who have come together, I would approach the one that's been most vocal and that's been most galvanized, because that is really the base of employees that you are going to be supporting, and to have you and them really ready for this is what's most important. I will say that most of the time we see women's ERGs being the first ERGs that companies start. I'll also say that that's the ERG that is most prevalent. A women's ERG within an organization is most prevalent. So there are many instances when a company won't have ERGs, but they'll have a women's group, for example, and they're like, oh yeah, I guess that is an ERG. So I don't know if that's any consideration for you as you're thinking about this. And let's see. I'm looking now at this next one. I feel like leadership at my organization sees participation in ERGs as like extracurriculars. How do I get them to view ERG activity as real work and as being more central to our business strategy? I love that question. It's so important. And I'm going to take this back to the pillars here, because I think you're going to have to do a few things in tandem in order to get your company leadership to really get excited about this. The things you have to do in tandem, you'll likely have to advocate. So one of the things that you'll be advocating for is hopefully specifically for the different experiences of your employee, of the employee identity that you represent. But you might also have to advocate for this level of support for employee resource groups, so that they can see that, okay, in addition to you advocating for the particular identity, you also are letting them know that this is something you're feeling. Now, I say you have to do two things in tandem, because you can't just do that, right? You'll have to really show them how valuable you are. And we know that there's a research that supports that employee resource groups can help build connection to a company, that employees can feel more invested in their company when they are involved in an employee resource group. We know that there are also associations between employee resource group activity and senses of belonging, which can be really powerful. So there's a lot of great statistics out there that I encourage you to accumulate and build into your advocacy for this when you're talking to your leaders. But also there's an aspect of show, don't tell on this one. There's an aspect of really showing here that you're valuable. And you can do that by leaning into the other two pillars here. Really leaning into creating spaces of continued growth and self-reflection with your organization, right? Set up those initiatives I was talking about. You know, maybe you don't have too much money, you don't have a big budget, because maybe they're not fully there for you. But if you make enough noise and show that there's a lot that you're contributing, they'll start to notice. You can do the same by building these safe spaces and creating more of a community across as employee resource group. And so if you do both of those things in tandem, that advocacy pillar and in leaning into these other two pillars, you can make a big difference. I think that's where a lot of our clients or people that we know of who are leaders at companies, they'll come to us and say, there's a lot of activity happening here. We don't know what to do with it. That's when they start to notice. Great. Okay. Ooh, nice. Thank you for sending in these questions. Please keep them coming. Okay. My company has around 300 employees and about 230 of us are white. Okay. Should we be forming ERGs around racial or ethnic identities that only apply to a handful of employees? Is it appropriate to create a catch-all people of color ERG? Okay. It is certainly appropriate. We see companies do it all the time. We see companies decide that they're just going to create a BIPOC ERG, maybe and BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color ERG. It is not, you're not alone if you end up doing that. So it's not unpopular to do something like that if you feel like there are very few people of color. If I were you, and I don't know here if that's your first employee resource group, but you might also want to look into what's really exciting people. So it's possible in your particular case that the people of color within your organization are really feeling a need to talk about what it means to be a person of color within your company. In which case, especially if you're getting that sense and you're really feeling like there's a desire, I say 100% go into something like that and feel comfortable creating an ERG that is maybe a little bit more broad. And over time, what we do often see is as companies like that begin to grow, or as employees begin to really lean into this employee resource group, there'll be some offshoots that might come up, right? Just like we saw in that example from Xerox, where they started with a Black employee resource group, and 10, 15 years later, there was also a Black women's group, right? That kind of breaking off sometimes happens, and you might see that happens, or you might just have an umbrella collective and little groups of solidarity or little spaces where people can really advocate on behalf of different more specific identities. So I say definitely go for that, and let the community or the employees take you where you go, right? Maybe women are also very interested in having something like that. So go that direction. Maybe your LGBTQ plus community is pretty large and excited, so go in that direction. Really feel for what you're sensing from your people. Okay, we have a couple more coming through. I work in HR, and I know that my company could benefit from an ERG, but everyone already feels overworked. How can I get people to participate if they don't feel like they have time? Ooh, this is a big topic of conversation. We actually have been talking a lot about this because of the topic of burnout and how it's so on people's minds. In fact, I'll share a little bit more about this later, but we'll be doing a Q&A session specifically about burnout next in November. What I suggest, if you are, again, on the planning side of this, or you're kind of more potentially more of a top-down perspective, I would say start with smaller events and see what kinds of excitement you get from people, and then leverage that excitement to move forward with your ERG creation. So I agree that creating an entire employee resource group, unless you have people who are like, I'm busy, but I really want this. If it's just you on the HR side thinking about creating this, I would certainly consider doing small events here and there, while soliciting excitement and volunteerism from your workforce, right? So doing a panel, for example, where you feature maybe an internal panel where you feature what people are doing. Maybe it's a caregiver panel, how people are balancing things. If people are feeling overworked, then they might enjoy the opportunity to hear from someone who identifies similarly. Maybe they themselves are also caregivers, or maybe they themselves are also parents. And so you maybe do like a parent panel. How are they managing all of this in virtual land, right? Start the conversation. Have these small internal sessions, maybe opportunities for storytelling. It will both create an excitement around the potential for employee resource groups, and it might also relieve some of the tension that's happening with all of the work that's going on. If you're not doing enough of those types of experiences, people might also feel overworked just because of the fact that everything they do with your company is about work, right? So that might also be really helpful. What is your opinion on having allies join ERGs? Legally, and this is something that we talk about all the time, legally, you are unable to discriminate against employees, even if it means that you're trying to make safe spaces for employee resource groups. So for example, if you have a group that's forming that is a Black employee resource group, and You want to make sure that there are opportunities for Black employees to come together and engage in the experience together. We have heard, and this is a consistent question that comes in, people wondering if they can not include allies. And the fact is that you can get into legal concerns if you end up doing that. So we always advise against discriminating or telling people that only fill in the blank identity is allowed here. Instead, what I would suggest is that you open your ERG up to allies for everything. So at every moment, for every employee resource group, an ally is welcome to come. However, there may be some events, some activities, some initiatives that you never say that allies cannot come, but you always, in those instances where you really want them to be spaces that are safe for people who identify particularly with that identity, just say that you'd really love to make this particular event something that is a safe space for people to come together who identify in this particular way. You don't turn people away who come through. You don't make it a thing that you say that only such and such is allowed. And that's how you make sure that this employee resource group is open to allies. You can also create events that are just for allies or that are encouraged for allies, right? You can create engagements where you say allies are encouraged to attend to learn more about how they can become better allies to this particular group. So 100% include allies. And the way that you make sure that you're creating targeted spaces is by being very clear about your messaging while also inviting anyone who wants to engage in. Okay, a few more going on here. What is the first step in getting our upper management to see the value in ERGs? Thank you for asking. I think there was a question earlier that maybe touched on this a little bit, but I would do a combined approach of advocating for ERGs. So looking at these pillars again, I would do a combined approach of advocating for employee resource groups by using the data that is easily accessible. You can find research papers that have been written about the efficacy and value of employee resource groups. So you can, create certain pitch decks, you can set up time with leaders, you can share this information with people that you have influence over or support from. But also, I would start advocating or engaging in opportunities to educate and build solidarity ad hoc. So if you're in that position where you are not upper management and you're trying to create an employee resource group, start that grassroots activity that I spoke about earlier. Be that person or those people who come together and, respectfully advocate for this while doing really interesting stuff that gets people talking and then makes it so upper management has to pay a little bit of attention. Okay, we have a couple of longer questions here. Great. After our company renewed its commitment to DEI in the summer of 2020, okay, many companies did that, they expanded the budget allocated to ERG activities. That's great. Unfortunately, since we are staying fully remote through the new year, we haven't had good ways to use that budget. And I'm worried that it'll get cut for 2022. Okay, that's fair. Do you have ideas for leveraging that budget in the next 2.5 months while we're still virtual? If we don't use it, what can I do to advocate for keeping the expanded budget next year? Okay, fair question. Time's ticking on this one. I think that there might be quite a few things that you can, if you're looking to spend money, there are quite a few things that you can spend money on related to pulling in speakers. So that's something that often ERG budgets will go to, pulling in speakers, pulling in trainers, hosting those kinds of education related events. You might also be able to engage in some community work where sometimes maybe you're still in virtual world. If you all are in a particular area or city or region, you might be able to do something where you're donating to a good cause and maybe coming together virtually to support it, or you're donating to a good cause and coming together in person to support it, maybe doing a walk or doing some sort of community service in the community if you're able and allowed to do that. You might also want to do events where you send gift cards. So something that's been really popular, I'm not sure if you've already done this, but is hosting a community event. Maybe you're bringing people together and everyone is sharing something that they value deeply related to their culture or what have you. And while they do that, you also send them a gift card for a food delivery service, maybe $50 per person. And that's part of the event. And it gets many employees to come and it gets people talking because they also got free dinner on you. So I think there are interesting ways to get creative. Hopefully those were 3 things that you can consider. I recognize that there are definitely ways that this virtual world makes it difficult to spend money. I also would say that you can let your management know about this. Let those who are making those decisions about budgeting, let them know that, hey, if we didn't spend all of the money, it's because we spent it here. But next year, when we get back in person, we're anticipating doing these other events. So you can also advocate in that way by showing them the kinds of differences in the event types that you're planning to do for 2022, so that you can hopefully keep that budget, if not grow it. Okay. What exactly happens in an ERG? Like, what types of things do they do? Oh, okay. Well, hopefully you were able to hear some examples from what I mentioned. These strategic pillars are meant to be very much supportive of what employee resource groups do. So when employee resource groups know that they want to exist but aren't sure what kinds of things they should be doing, we always point to these 3 pillars because they can be really great starting points, right? I can give you a couple of examples again within each of these pillars if that's helpful. Again, solidarity is creating community, a space for those who identify and their allies to come together. Maybe it's just talking about a current event, something that happened in current events. I know that when the Stop Asian Hate movement was really, really present, many ERGs that serve the Asian population within American companies were coming together and talking about what that meant for them and what feelings were coming forward. And it was cathartic for many of those who came together to talk about that, in some instances for the first time in a work context, right? And so that was something that could be organized by your employee resource group to help those employees feel more deeply seen and heard and feel like they have a place to come and share how they're really feeling. And we know that when people share those kinds of feelings and stories, they are more deeply connected with each other. So that's a solidarity bit. Advocacy, maybe there's a desire. For example, there was a company that was mentioned in one of these questions where there could be a need to bring in more diversity. And so maybe that, I believe that's the group that was talking about a BIPOC or people of color employee resource group. Maybe that employee resource group works with the recruitment team to advocate for more diversity recruitment strategies and to advocate for maybe getting them onto HBCU campuses. Those are historically Black colleges and universities, or working with Hispanic serving institutions, schools with a larger population of Latinx students. That's the advocacy piece. On the education side, there's also fostering an environment that encourages continued growth, right? So there's this idea of creating opportunities for people to think about these topics maybe differently than they were used to thinking about them. Again, hosting a movie night, a book club, maybe even a podcast to watch party or listen party, where maybe every couple of weeks you listen to this podcast and talk about it, something like a book club. So those are some examples of what you might do as an employee resource group. Here are a couple of others we have. Within our women's ERG, we came up with some things that management could do to make work better and easier, but they won't listen to our ideas or take us seriously. They sit in the belief that because the ERG exists, the work is done. What do I do? Oh, that one's a tricky one. Definitely, we know that all of this work is continual work, right? So the work is never done. I think you share that belief that there's still work to do, and even though the ERG exists, that obviously doesn't finish the work that there is to do. I think there are a couple of things that I might suggest if I were you. The first is to consider creating spaces for women to come together and to share some of the things that they are concerned about, even if it's anonymously. So you can organize maybe some sort of space where maybe it's virtual, maybe it's a survey or something like that, that you, if your management allows you to send a survey, that you send out, or maybe it's a place where people can come on a weekly basis just for community. And maybe on a weekly basis, you speak to each other about some of the concerns that you might have within the organization that you think are still, that there's still left to do. What I'm getting at is helping to codify some of those things that might still be left is important and helpful. It's the thing that you can do to show your management that this ERG is only the first step of many, because part of the ERG's job is to make sure that the women in this particular instance are feeling supported. So I encourage you to consider growing that list and just pulling it together in the most respectful way and sharing it with your human resources department, even if anonymously, so that they can see that there are certain things that you'd want to move forward with. And you can share that also in a way that speaks to some of your initiatives. So maybe you're specifically looking for ways that women feel that they could be better included in meeting conversations. We know from much of the research that women can often be interrupted while sharing stories or ideas. Sometimes our ideas are co-opted. That's something that happens. And so maybe you can work to find those instances and make sure that that's something that is shared in terms of just some data that the management team can pull from. You can also maybe spend some time thinking about some of those very well-researched ways that women are still not being supported in many workplaces, and start creating ways of intervening with that. So with that particular example, you can put together some inclusive meeting practices, right? And maybe work with your management to put those inclusive meeting practices together. And when you do that, maybe over time, you will be sharing those those inclusive meeting practices with other managers, and it will catch on that, wow, that was really useful. What else can this ERG do? I hope that was helpful. I feel like that one was a tricky one. Okay, let's see. What would you recommend be a good starting budget for a newly started LGBTQ ERG? And then we have another longer question here that I will answer in a second. Great. So the budget for a newly started LGBTQ ERG, I think for any employee resource group, budget is always a question that comes up because they should have a budget. However, it depends on the size of your company. It depends on the kinds of initiatives your employee resource group, this particular employee resource group, who's looking to do. And what we often say is that there's a range that companies allocate to employee resource groups based off of the number of members they believe are involved. And when I say members, I don't necessarily mean people who identify as fill in the blank. So in this case, I don't mean necessarily people who identify as LGBTQ within your company. Remember, employee resource groups are open to members who identify and allies. So what I would look at is the makeup of the employee resource group, how many people are in it. And then there's typically a range of between $100 and $500 per person for these members, for the membership of the employee resource group, 100 being on the lower end, obviously, and then 500 being on the higher end. And imagine if the size is quite large, depending on the size of your company, that can be quite a bit of money. And so thinking about what that looks like for you, that budgeting changes over time. I would also, as a newly minted employee resource group, really get to know what your system is within your company, within your organization, because maybe they haven't figured out their system yet, and you can help them figure out that system by sharing some of the activities you're hoping to do, and also proposing a budget based off of that. So going kind of into the future a little bit, planning out your next 6 months, what would be your pie in the sky budget, and then going to your leadership and saying, this is what we plan to do, this is our budget request, and seeing if there's a way to negotiate around that. Okay, let's see here. We have a longer question here. Our women's ERG has been experiencing some tension lately. Among other things, there have also been complaints around programming related to diet and fitness being fatphobic or enforcing harmful beauty standards, and questions about whether trans women or non-binary people should be involved. I'm really worried about the impact that all this drama might have on the group overall. How do I support the ERG leadership in navigating these kinds of conflicts? Yeah, this one, I glanced at this one and I was like, okay, there's a lot going on here. So it sounds like there's concern around size inclusivity and around trans and just gender identity inclusivity broadly, which is often something that happens when we're talking about, in this particular case, gender identity and those folks who identify as non-binary, not necessarily feeling included in a women's network. Makes a ton of sense. So I don't know if you're tackling that first. I don't know if your organization has an LGBTQ ERG, one where maybe some of your trans or non-binary folks will find that they're maybe more supported and more included. That is often, I think, where many of the employees who identify as such find more of a home. Not though that doesn't mean that you shouldn't address what's happening within the women's ERG, because of course that's something that is necessary to approach. So I think there are two things here. Finding a place where that particular group of employees is feeling supported, and hopefully you have a LGBTQ group where that exists for them. But then the second thing is working in tandem, potentially with your LGBTQ group, and to support the women's group or the women's leadership, or whoever is encouraging this kind of exclusion toward people based off of those things, to learn and grow. So again, one of the major things that employee resource groups do, so one of these pillars is education. And so this might require some just supporting, obviously, as someone who seems to be outside of this a little bit, because it sounds like you're helping to support the leadership and navigate these conflicts. It will require that you spend some time with these leaders and with their people to create some sort of opportunity for them to learn about the ways in which they may have been exclusive towards trans women and non-binary people. And so that is something that you can either, work to create some sort of event, or you can set up some time for people to do some cross ERG conversations, really talk about those experiences in a candid way. There are a whole host of things that you can do, but I definitely suggest that you move forward with helping them talk to each other about that. On the fatphobic side of things, with the harmful beauty standards, this is something that certainly happens regularly, not just in women's ERGs, but across all of our work experiences, right? Size inclusivity is one of the segments of identity, or size is one of the segments of identity that we talk about among the least. This is something where you might, as someone who's supporting these ERGs, want to create some sort of opportunity for everyone to learn about that particular topic, maybe bringing in an expert, maybe creating a place where those who maybe were really hurt by those experiences to be able to talk to someone. Maybe it's someone, a counselor or someone like that who is very, very skilled in talking about fat phobia or about harmful beauty standards or about the ways that food and diet and exercise can be really triggering for certain people. And then you'll want to also talk to your women's group about how they're handling that. There's a whole lot there. Let's talk offline. Okay, there's still some questions coming through, but we're running out of time. So let me answer this last one. And then if you continue to have questions, we're open to hearing them. Or maybe you can take the ERG course and send us an email at info@cnetwork.com or come to our next Q&A. Okay, next question I will pick here. I'm the only woman of color, and I want to develop a community like you were describing, but the staff to support it does not exist. Any tips? Okay. Ooh, if you are the only woman of color, this is a very, very tricky one. If you are truly the only woman of color, there are a couple of things here. So I don't know if you're able to feel supported on other dimensions. So maybe you're the only woman of color, but maybe there are other people of color and you can work with people of color to create an employee resource group that's specific to them, to you. So that's one thing. Maybe you can find some support in a women's group if there is one that exists, or you can start creating a community amongst women. I do think, however, intersectionality in the way you're describing is important, right? And it's important to validate that and to find community within that. If you are the only one, though, that is where I might suggest you do what I just suggested, right? With the potential groups for people of color and women, and you really work with them to also think about how on the advocacy side, there's room to advocate for more diversity, specifically on the women of color front. But I also, if I were you, would look outside of your company for community on that front. If you're really desiring to connect with a community of women of color, there are several organizations that you can look into that are meeting virtually on a regular basis, and that can provide that kind of space for you to feel connected and supported in that way. And so if you're not getting that thing that you're really looking for from these other groups, and maybe for some time you won't, right? If you're the only one, I would also go elsewhere, and that's completely okay. I know I'm a member of several groups outside of my own workspace, right? And they can be very, very beneficial just in building your network generally and meeting new people. Great. That's all the time we have for all of these questions. Y'all kept it coming. That was beautiful. So I do want to close out by just sharing a little bit more about us, and hopefully you hang tight. Again, we have this wonderful course that you can take if you want to learn more about employee resource groups. I highly encourage you to. You can also see there that we have a course on recruitment bias and how to mitigate it. So if that also piques your interest, you're welcome to do that. We also have a free consultation that you can engage in if, say, your company is really looking for support. If you found what I was sharing helpful, if you want to have us at your disposal more as advisors regularly, or if you have a particular project you'd like help doing with you, you can let us know through this consultation, cnetwork.com/consultation. We're also on all of these different social media platforms. You can find us on Twitter, on Instagram, on YouTube, on LinkedIn, and then we also have a newsletter. So if you're not yet engaged as a member of our newsletter, please sign up, cnetwork.com/newsletter. We have another one of these coming up next month. So every month now we do these free Q&A sessions where I or one of my colleagues will just kind of tell you what's going on in the space, tell you a little bit about how we're thinking about some of these topics. The next one is about addressing burnout through your inclusion initiatives. Burnout is a top of mind conversation right now. We're hearing about it everywhere we go. You're welcome to join us at our next session taking place on November 16th. And I see here we have this green thing to make it really stand out for you, this teal thing. So the last thing I'll say before we all sign off is we are excited to give you a discount. So I was just talking about all of these courses that we have, and one of them is all about this employee resource group topic of conversation. If you are interested in getting a 40% discount off of any course, just one of any course, you can send an email to us at info@cnetwork.com with the name of your preferred course. And you have to do it within the next 30 minutes, just so that we can keep track of all of this. And feel free to send that out to us, and you'll have to sign up, which will expire within 30 days. And you actually will get access to the course for a year. It's a year-long access to all of the different topics that we discuss. So again, you can email info@cnetwork.com. You get that discount code. It expires in 30 days. Please let us know if that's what you want. But all of you who are here are privy to this. So thank you all for engaging. And we have about 5 more minutes. So maybe while we have 5 more minutes, I can look at one other question if we have any more that have come through. No, actually, that was the last one. I think we answered all of them, which was really cool. Thank you everyone for coming. I'll leave this on the screen, and if any other questions come through in the next 5 minutes, I'll answer this. Oh, will the recording be shared? Yes, actually, this recording will be shared on YouTube. So one thing we care deeply about at CNetwork is working to really create a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive workplace for everyone. And in order to do that, we think it's important to not just work exclusively with our clients and to hopefully get really amazing initiatives off the ground for our clients, but we also want to get this information out there as much as possible and really support all of you in all of your initiatives, even if it means that we're not working very closely together. So yes, all of our sessions are posted on YouTube. And once this one is posted, we will send it out. So subscribe to our YouTube channel. Let me go back to that page if you're not already subscribed. It's just called CNetwork LLC. That's where you can find our YouTube. And if you're subscribed, you'll get the notification for when we post this, which should be in the next week or so. Thank you, everyone. It was an absolute pleasure seeing all of you. I actually didn't see any of you. It was an absolute pleasure answering all of your questions. And thank you for coming. I guess we'll end there.